Everyone. I hope everyone is healthy, safe, and remaining quite productive. Today we have a really neat paper that Miguel and Johannes and Michael are on for. Before they get started, I just want to remind you that if you have questions, you should go ahead and use the chat, and Rob and I will pick those out and sort of intercede when necessary to give Ted the questions. And from there, of course, at the end, we'll try to save a little bit of time. So we have questions that can summarize the paper. So before Rob goes into his introduction of Ted, I want to say, first of all, Ted, welcome.
Thanks.
I am a fan of yours since all the way back in the late 90s. I heard about this guy, this really smart guy, who was doing some field work in Kenya. And Ted graduated in 2000 from Harvard. And one of my favorite papers of not only Ted's, but in all the Devo community is his work in 2004 in Econometrica. I thought that was really a clever piece of research and very path-breaking. So I want to say, Ted, welcome. It's great to have you. And thanks a lot for being a pioneer in the field experimental approach.
Well, thanks, John. Yeah, thanks, Ted. So Ted is the Oxford Professor of Environmental and Resource Economics at the Department of Economics at University of California, Berkeley. He is also a founder and the director of the Center for Effective Global Action at Berkeley as well. So in addition to having this great paper, we're really excited to have Ted give today's seminar because, as John was saying, he's a veteran in the field of field experiments, and he's been thinking hard about how to understand economic development and how that interacts with many of the important domains and questions this seminar series has already started to look at, like education, crime, collective action, health, the environment, and productivity. So today's paper is awesome, and it's on the general equilibrium effects of cash transfers with a field experimental evidence from Kenya. And the digital floor is over to you, Ted.
All right.
Thank you.
Rob, thanks a lot. John, thanks a lot. And I'm really delighted that my co-authors, Michael Walker from Berkeley and Johannes Haushofer from Princeton are here, and just great to be able to share this event with them. So our other co-authors are Dennis Egger at Berkeley and Paul Niehaus at UCSD. So yeah, today I'll be speaking about general equilibrium effects of cash, and this builds on, as John said, quite a bit of experience working in Kenya. This has been a project we've been working on now for a while, and it was a pretty large-scale field operation, as you'll see. So really all five of us worked, and many other people worked really hard on this project for many years. So just to get started, I want to give a little bit of background. In macroeconomics and economics as a whole, it's long been of interest to try to understand how cash transfers, how stimulus spending, how fiscal policy affect aggregates of importance like total output or affect welfare. We can go back to Keynes and even before about understanding these sorts of effects. There's been a burst of work in the last 5 years or so in macroeconomics, where macroeconomists are using some new empirical tools that are closer to micro, applied micro in many cases, to try to understand these issues again. And they've made a lot of progress on these issues, but these kinds of questions have typically not been able to be studied experimentally. And really that's our goal in the study, is to try to bring our experimental toolkit to studying these core macro issues. At the same time, and in parallel, there's been this trend in development economics over the last, I guess, 15 years or so, 20 years even, trying to understand the effects of cash transfers, really at the micro level. There's been an explosion of work in this area. There's tons of countries that have adopted conditional cash transfer programs, unconditional cash transfer programs, and a number of well-identified studies using experimental designs or RD designs have examined these issues, like scores and scores of studies. And the kind of behavioral responses of the recipients have been well studied. So there's papers trying to understand what cash does in a wide range of areas, and receiving a large cash transfer affects a range of economic outcomes and household choices. one finding in that literature, one concern has always been that giving cash could have negative effects, but at least some of those concerns haven't been borne out in most of the data so far. There haven't been many cases in poor countries of reduced work effort when people get cash. There haven't been many cases of people spending all the money on alcohol, things like that. So there's been largely sort of positive evidence on benefits for recipients, but we don't know nearly as much about the broader aggregate effects of these programs. And these are programs that are not just small pilot programs now, they're really large scale programs. So we want to understand the aggregate effects of these large scale cash transfer programs. And it's plausible to think that there could be broader effects and spillovers of cash transfer programs. If I get cash and I spend it, the dollar that I spent goes in someone else's pocket. So it's going to affect the broader economy just automatically. There's been a couple studies, and I cite them here on the bottom of the slide, looking at some of these spillovers. So there's a kind of emerging literature on this in a few cases. A couple of those studies from Mexico, from the early cash transfer programs, but really a limited literature, and that's really the literature that we want to contribute to. So we designed this study with this kind of ambition of uniting these two literatures and bringing our experimental toolkit to studying the aggregate effects of cash transfer programs. Obviously, to do this, we needed to work at large scale, and we were fortunate to work with a partner that was able to carry out a large-scale cash transfer program. So let me just mention 4 methodological points on the study that are worth keeping in mind that really allow us to do what we want to do here. We worked with the NGO Give Directly, which is pretty well known in development circles for giving cash transfers via mobile money. They raised $11 million in cash to distribute as part of this project. So this is clearly the largest sort of NGO program that I've worked with in terms of a original RCT. This was a large transfer. So over the peak 12 months of transfers, this constituted about 17% of GDP in the most affected areas, the areas where the cash was concentrated. And I'll tell you about the design, of course, in a few slides. So a very large local economic shock. That was the first element. What we were also able to do is work with them to design a project that didn't just randomize at the household level or even the village level, like a lot of existing programs, but randomized at larger geographic units. So we have this kind of spatial concentration of cash at a area called the sublocation, which is a cluster of something like 12 to 15 villages. So this is really concentrating cash transfers into a particular economic area, and that's going to be pretty important for our design. Another point I want to highlight, which may not sound very sexy, but is incredibly important for what we do, as you'll see, is we put a lot of time developing measures and deploying very detailed measurement. And actually, without this measurement, we wouldn't be able to do this study, as you'll see very soon. We collected censuses of all population in the study region. So we censused about 300,000 people. We censused every enterprise. So we put, we had a very large field team, put a lot of time into censusing everybody and then carrying out surveys, very detailed household and firm surveys for representative subsamples, randomly drawn subsamples of this population. So we can capture economic activity in a representative sense in a way that's unusual for this kind of project. We also collected very detailed price data. So we collected price data, there were like hundreds of thousands of independent price points being collected again, and I'll talk more about that data. So it's an unusual setup just because it was such a large scale data collection operation. Finally, and I'm not going to have as much time today to get into the details, but we do develop a theoretical framework to try to understand the results and organize our empirical findings and really try to link the patterns we find in the data to welfare as a key outcome for us. We're also going to have a few things to say about the link between the multiplier of all this cash, which is something I'll come back to, and welfare, which is something actually in the macro literature that is very often not discussed, but is pretty important. And there's a lot of reasons why a large multiplier may or may not necessarily lead to big welfare gains. So we'll talk about those effects. So this is kind of the overview of this project. I want to give you, again, because it's a little bit of a shortened seminar, give you a little bit of a kind of set of highlights up front in terms of where we're going, and then we'll get into all the details. we do find that the households that receive cash have big increases in consumption. But one of the first kind of striking findings when we started analyzing the data was that even the non-recipient households in these areas also showed big increases in consumption. And I'll talk more about the timing of this data and how to interpret these 13% numbers in a bit. But this was our first hint that there really were some spillover effects of this program. It wasn't just the recipients benefiting, even the non-recipients showed changes in terms of economic circumstances. When we look at total consumption in the areas that got more cash, that increase in total consumption actually lines up quite closely with the increase in total revenue in local enterprises. So I think this was part of the payoff of the very detailed data collections. We could kind of trace the money that was being spent, trace it to the revenue that was being raised by local firms. And so, both on the consumption side and the income side, we're getting kind of similar numbers. When we dove into trying to understand these increased earnings for the non-recipients, we found increases in labor earnings. So the folks who didn't get cash, if you look at them about a year and a half later, they're earning more. And, this comes from, we can document this in our data, is linked to higher enterprise wage bills. So, recipients are spending money, enterprises are getting more revenue, and some of that's being paid out in higher wage bills, including to the non-recipients who then spend more themselves. So we can kind of trace out that money. Strikingly, we don't find big effects on reported total hours worked. And this was a very kind of important finding for us and goes against some of the kind of modeling that you see in the kind of multiplier macro literature, where sort of like, increases in labor supply would be a big part of the story. I'm going to come back to this and try to interpret what's going on in terms of labor utilization later on, but it's an important part of our story. A final point was, again, we measured prices really precisely, and we do find a little bit of price inflation, but it's really small. So it's less than 1%. Really across goods, it's pretty small. There's a little bit more price inflation in more remote communities. There's a little bit more price inflation for non-tradable goods, things that you would kind of expect in a trade perspective, but for the most part, we don't see output goods prices increasing. So this is a pretty striking finding. We're seeing this increase in output without much inflation. The prices that we do see some changes on are for some input. So there's some indication that wages are higher and some indication that even land prices may be higher. Okay, so that's a bit of an overview, and I know that was a lot to take in. So let me get into the details and walk you through how we get there. And again, please bring your questions to us, and hopefully we'll get a chance to to answer them. And even though I'll be presenting, I know Michael and Johannes are on the chat, so maybe they can even jump in. Okay, so in terms of like the kind of macro implications, I started out by saying we want to understand the aggregates here. When we estimate the local multiplier, the transfer multiplier, we get numbers that are bigger than 2. So these are pretty big multipliers. They're a bit larger than the kinds of multipliers that have been measured in the recent U.S. macro literature. Although those are fiscal multipliers, and these are transfer multipliers, which are slightly different quantities. But we're finding evidence of quite sizable multipliers, and we actually compute the multiplier 2 different ways. Once using the consumption data that I mentioned, once using the income data, sort of different data sources within our data set, and get very similar numbers of around 2.3 or 2.4. And we spend quite a bit of time in the paper trying to understand how this is possible and sort of how production increases without measured increases in hours worked. We find some suggestive evidence that there actually is some slack capacity, both in terms of labor and capital in the local economy. And again, I'll come back to that. But the idea is in our data, at least, a number of workers who are working in local shops, working in local retail and manufacturing establishments for pretty sizable chunks of the day may not actually be working. They're sort of one of the common responses when asked what workers were doing in certain parts of the day was waiting for customers. So you could imagine in that sort of setting where there is some slack capacity, an aggregate demand shock could lead to better utilization, both of labor and capital inputs. And I'll come back to this later on.
Hey,
Yeah,
Ted,
go ahead.
Yeah, quick question.
Go for it, John.
So can you give us a little bit of flavor around what factors or determinants would affect the local transfer multiplier? So what I'm thinking is, a lot of times the question is, if we have a small scale result and we scale that up, what will happen to the GE effects? That's sort of one question. Now, in your world, it's if you had more people given the same amount of money or the same number of people given more, what would you expect happen to the multiplier in those particular cases?
Yeah, that's a great question. And actually, these kinds of issues are really central in a lot of the macro kind of theory treatments of this. So if folks know the Farhi-Werning kind of work from a few years ago, the issue of the marginal propensity to consume is really central. So distributing more cash to fewer people or less cash to more people could affect the marginal propensity to consume. That could affect the multiplier. Also, the types of people that are targeted for the cash could really matter. So actually, we're working in a setting, and I'll come back to the details in a few slides, where the NGO was targeting the poorest households. In a poor part of Kenya, they targeted this region because it was poor. They're targeting the poorest households. In the kind of macro theory terminology, like these are hand-to-mouth consumers. The marginal propensity to consume is very high, and I'll show you a number in a few slides on that. So that's going to be really critical. And in the simplest kind of Keynesian models we all remember from undergrad, there's this like one-to-one relationship between the MPC and the multiplier. Obviously, it's more complicated here with the dynamics, but that's going to be critical. So thanks for raising that. And I think just to answer your question more specifically, if the cash had been targeted to like richer people, or even within Kenya, richer people in Nairobi, we might have gotten quite a different multiplier. So this is not some like universal, like God-given number. This is going to be a function of the context and the characteristics of the people receiving cash. So thanks for raising that. So one last point on welfare. We worked through a kind of our framework to try to understand welfare, and the indication that we have in the data is there are almost certainly quite sizable welfare gains from this program. Again, we're finding increases in household income and budget sets without really measuring offsetting labor supply responses, which would be disutility, right? So if you increase income but work a lot more, that may or may not be too sizable a welfare gain. Well, we're not really seeing that kind of labor supply response. We also put a lot of time into trying to measure externality. So I'm mainly going to focus today on these sort of market-mediated consumption and income measures. But a cash transfer could affect household choices in many other dimensions. It could also affect public goods provision. Michael Walker, my co-author on this, has a separate paper looking at the same data, studying public goods outcomes as a result of these transfers. So we study those, and we don't find adverse effects of those on a wide range of sort of spillover type outcomes. So our best sense in looking at this program is there almost certainly were some sizable welfare gains. Okay, so let me give a little background on the context and the data, and then I'm going to really just go through some more of the details on the results. Again, I'm going to skip a couple slides here and there when we get into the nitty gritty on some of the models, because I want to make sure we get to the key conceptual points. But again, please ask questions if issues come up. Okay, so this is the setting in Western Kenya. It's Siaya County. There's 653 villages in the sample, so it's a pretty large sample. As I mentioned, the population in these villages is about 300,000 people. Each village has about 100 households with 4 to 5 household members. So, about 400 or 500 people per village. About half of them are children, and that's as expected. The median age in Kenya is 18. So there's a lot of kids here as well. Everybody in this region is working in agriculture, but many people have other jobs. So there's a lot of self-employment. Some of those are small businesses out of the home. Some of those are shops in a village or in a market nearby. And about half of folks also work for wages. This is a pretty typical, for people familiar with a kind of rural East African setting, this is a pretty typical setting where households really are diversifying across multiple activities. The respondent median age was about 40-something, and they had, about 6 years of school, so had not quite finished primary school on average. So again, pretty typical for rural East Africa. Another important background feature is the period that we study, 2014 to 2017, is a period of steady positive economic growth, about 3% per capita growth per year. Kenya was not in recession. There were no national elections or political instability during our study period. So it's a period of like nice, steady economic growth and stability. They weren't in a big recession at this time. That's important to keep in mind in studying the multiplier, just because in a lot of the multiplier studies that have been done recently, the stimulus was focused during recessions, where you might expect there's more spare capacity or underutilization. And so we study the Give Directly program. I mentioned this. Give Directly targets the poorest households using a simple proxy means test, here having a grass thatched roof. The money is transferred via mobile money, which is ubiquitous in Kenya, way more than it is in the US. So almost everybody has mobile money. The few that didn't were brought into mobile money. The money was distributed in 3 tranches over about 8 months, a small initial tranche and then 2 larger tranches. And they add up to be about $1,000 in nominal terms, or about $1,800 in PPP terms. So again, this is a really large transfer for these households. It's about 3/4 of mean annual household consumption. And as I mentioned before, a really big local income shock in the areas getting the transfers. The way it works is households get the mobile money, and anecdotally, almost all households immediately withdraw it from mobile money into cash, and many of them spend a lot of it right away. And this is going to get to the MPC point before, our best guess is, the vast majority of that money is spent over the next year or so. This is the study area. You can see the dots here are villages in the sample. We have coverage of almost all villages in this county. There's a few sublocations you can see, the kind of lighter lines that had participated in some earlier programs, but we have almost full coverage in this county. The black circles are treated, the open circles are control, and then the red stars are markets. So these are locations of regular weekly markets or permanent markets, and you can see there's 60-something of these in the study area, kind of scattered around. A key part of the research design, as I mentioned, was not just randomizing villages to treatment and control, but also randomizing sublocations into what we call high saturation and low saturation areas. In the high saturation areas, 2/3 of villages receive cash transfers. The poor households receive cash transfers. In the low saturation areas, only 1/3 of villages received cash transfers. Again, the poor in those villages. So there's this big difference in the rate of treatment in high and low saturation areas, but there's some variation. There's some treated and controlled villages in both types of areas. The other thing I want to point out is these sublocation boundaries don't really mean anything. Everybody pretty much belongs to the same ethnic group in this area. People move and shop across these sublocation boundaries. So in the empirical analysis, we're not just going to use the variation from high and low saturation sublocations, but really all the experimental variation induced by the randomization, because I could live near a border with another sublocation, and the villages on the other side of the border were also randomized into treatment and control. So that's going to be I'll come back to that in the experimental design. What I want to do first, though, is talk about the data. And in particular, I'm going to zoom in on this one part of the northern part of the county that has both high and low saturation sublocations, and you can see a bunch of the village dots there. So now we've zoomed in, and you can see all these villages. They're quite proximate to each other. Within 2 kilometers on average, a typical village has 7 other villages. So pretty densely populated area. And the average distance to a market is typically 2 to 3 kilometers. So, not too far away. You can kind of see that here in the high saturation sublocation that's shaded dark gray here on the left. Most of the villages are treated, some are controlled, and the white areas on the right, it's the opposite. What I'm going to do here in blue is highlight 2 villages that are both control villages. But what you can see kind of immediately is around the control village on the left, if we draw a 2 kilometer radius, which is going to be important because our data is going to suggest that a lot of the effects are localized within about 2 kilometers. Almost all the villages around this control village are treated. So there's just tons of cash that's going to be going into this local economy. If you look at the village on the right, within 2 kilometers, there's a couple treated villages, but most are controlled. So a lot less cash is going in. So this is the kind of variation we exploit in order to study spillovers, just to make it kind of very concrete for you all here. Okay, let me zoom in a little more just to highlight the data, a bit here. So I'm going to zoom in on this one area, and you can see again our kind of focal village here in blue. The other villages nearby. There's a market about 2.5 kilometers away. What we did is we censused all the households. So these are all the households in the area. We went around, collected this data. Some of the households are eligible, meaning poor. They're the dark dots. Some are the gray dots. Those are the kind of slightly better off households. And we also censused all the enterprises. So you can see there's a whole cluster of enterprises up there in the top right, near the market center, kind of near the road. Not surprisingly, that's a permanent market there. But if you look closely, there's also a lot of those blue triangles scattered around, because in each village, typically, there's going to be a grain mill. It's called a posho mill, where people take their maize or their corn to get ground up so they can, eat it as, turn it into flour. There's small carpentry shops. There's small kind of local, workshops also out in the villages. So, again, there's this scattering of households and enterprises around. And then, the randomization means that some of those eligible households receive cash. Those are the ones in red here, and some don't. Okay, so this is just to give you a flavor. This is a pretty typical area in terms of density. And this is the kind of data we're going to be using in the analysis. Okay, so I've already kind of told you the kind of data we collected, so I'll go quickly here. We collected very detailed household surveys at baseline and end line with very good tracking rates over time, over 90% follow-up, balanced across treatment and control, and pretty big samples. So these were randomly selected households from the census, about 8,000. So, very detailed surveys with information, very detailed information on consumption, income, household outcomes. We also surveyed a representative sample of enterprises, and these were, we collected data on both agricultural enterprises and non-agricultural enterprises. The agricultural module was conducted within the household survey, but then we also collected detailed data on these non-ag enterprises. Because we censused everybody, we can actually match most firms from the enterprise survey to the household, which is, again, a very unusual kind of data. And, I'll be able to give you a little bit of breakdown on sort of which types of firms owned by what households were benefiting or had impacts here. And then, as I mentioned, we also had market price surveys across 61 markets. We collected data on 72 major commodities: food, non-food, hardware supplies, consumer products, et cetera. In each market, in each month, we collected data from 3 different vendors if available. So we really tried to get, a good sense of the data. And again, there's like hundreds of thousands of these market price data points that we collected. We also started the data collection on prices even before any of the cash went out. So we have kind of like pre-programmed market price data and see how things evolve as the cash transfers went out. And then finally, as I mentioned, my co-author, Michael Walker, has a separate project looking at local public finance outcomes. And he had led data collection on really detailed, local government surveys, et cetera. I'm going to just very briefly mention the results here, but he has separate work. Okay, so I'm giving, yeah, go ahead. Can
I ask just one question about how are you thinking about this from like a frame field experiment versus a natural field experiment? To the extent, do the households know like what is give directly? Do they know they're part of an experiment? And how do you sort of, if they didn't, how do you sort of contain that when you did the data analysis at the household level where they start talking with each other?
Yeah, so certainly the households know about give directly because, give directly sort of in parallel to all of our data collection, they were doing all of their usual outreach in these communities. Some communities were getting cash, others weren't. The communities knew that. And they knew a lot of data collection was going on in parallel. So I think households knew what was going on. Of course, in these kinds of settings, it's a little hard to know what the counterfactual even means. Here, like, would they have responded differently if we hadn't been doing all the data collection? It's possible. I could speculate on it, but I don't want to go beyond what I can say. here. I certainly know the big cash transfer was what they were really focused on. I think a little more than the surveys. This was like a pretty big transfer, but you know, it's always a concern with experiments or data collection that it could change behavior. Okay, so what are we going to focus on? And again, here I'm going to give you kind of like the high level effect. We're very interested in looking at the average total effect of this program. So what would be the effect of getting cash in an area where lots of other people are getting cash? That's the point of the GE study, relative to a counterfactual with no cash. Now here we face, you know, a bit of a challenge because this area was getting a lot of cash. So you know, there's not necessarily any area that's really like a pure control here. And that's something that we deal with and discuss in the paper. As I'll show you in a little bit, we end up finding that the cash effects we can estimate are quite localized, I think, which helps a little bit in thinking about the counterfactual. What we're focusing on in our main analysis is comparing the effect of cash in a certain area effectively to areas that just didn't get much cash. As I showed you, those areas in the sort of white, low saturation areas where almost no villages received cash within a few kilometers, those are the closest thing to a pure control that we have. And we're actually, you know, fortunate that the way the design worked out, there's really extensive variation in the density of treatment villages within 2 kilometers of a village, within 4 kilometers of a village, ranging from, you know, 0 or close to 0 up to, you know, much higher shares of villages getting treated. So that's the variation that we're able to exploit, subject to the caveat that, you know, it's possible that even those villages where no one within a few kilometers received cash also experienced some effects from the program. So, you know, we can't fully rule that out, but we still feel our design at this scale with the kind of variation we can observe is a step forward in the literature, even though we can't fully rule out that there's some ambient effect that kind of saturates the whole area. So that's the kind of econometric issue underlying the design. So again, we're going to focus on the total effect of, you know, say me receiving cash in my household, in my village, plus the neighborhood effects. That's what we're most focused on. I'll also in the tables have a column which is kind of the standard reduced form ITT style effect, just comparing treatment versus control villages. That's what, you know, most existing designs would focus on. We're going to show that design is going to miss out on a lot. And we're going to, you know, report results in US dollars, purchasing power parity adjusted, just to give us kind of a flavor for what the magnitudes mean. Okay, so I've taken about half an hour and I've given you guys now, you know, kind of the setup. Actually, I have one more slide on setup, and then I'm going to get into the results. So the last slide on setup is the actual econometric specification. I think hopefully this will be intuitive given what I've just said. We're focused on studying the effects on an outcome Y, like consumption or firm, you know, household consumption or firm revenue, as a function of the amounts of cash going into a village, that's AMT sub V, plus the amounts of cash going out at different distances from this village. And that's what the subscript R denote, different radii away from a village. And the variation in those amounts is driven by the experiment, by the experimental variation. So this is the kind of like, you know, I guess methodological highlight on some level is those amounts are randomized. One interpretation point that I want to raise, when we focus on the effect of cash per se going into a treatment village, if I'm an eligible household that received cash in a village where other eligible households received cash, I can't separately identify the effect of me getting cash from all my eligible neighbors getting cash, because those things were sort of assigned at the same time. So we're going to show you the effect of being an eligible household in a treatment village. You should interpret that as the effect of me receiving cash myself plus any within village spillovers. Then there's the second term here in the expression, which is the spillover effect across villages. Okay? So that's just an interpretation point. And then what I'm going to show you is the average effect of the program, multiplying these beta hats from this regression specification times the average transfer amounts to give you a sense of the average effect of the program, you know, of cash going in through this program. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense. If not, please bring questions through the chat, or we can answer them at the end. And we also try to take into account spatial correlation using the Conley approach. We also did randomization inference across this huge multi-level randomization and get almost identical results. Okay, so now I've gone through the setup in about half an hour, and let me get into some of the results. And again, given limited time, I'm going to go a little quickly. That's just because I want to get to the multiplier and some of the discussion at the end about Slack. Although, if I run out of time, we can get to it in the Q&A. So let me start by tracing out the flow of funds. I've already given you a flavor of this. This is our kind of main sort of setup of tables here. Column 1 is the standard treatment village versus control village effect that you would see in sort of most RCTs, the standard design. Column 2 comes from the regression specification I just showed you, which is the average effect of cash coming in to my village plus neighboring villages. And in terms of the kind of scale that matters for for these spillovers, we actually find in the data tells us that the effects are concentrated within about 2 kilometers. Beyond 2 kilometers, cash going in at 4 or 6 kilometers away doesn't have any significant effect on local outcomes. It's very concentrated and localized, and that's really what's coming through in column 2. So in terms of household expenditure, one of our core primary outcomes, the program boosted household expenditure, as you can see in the first row there, and both durable expenditure and non-durable expenditures both increased significantly. Food expenditure increased. We don't see much on temptation goods like alcohol spending here. There's also an increase in stated housing value. So this is just the respondents' own view on their housing value. This coincides with the anecdotal evidence that many individuals who receive the cash transfer will often make home improvements with the cash transfer. They'll improve their roofing, their flooring. So you can see a lot of large consumption effects and durable purchases here. Okay, so that's the kind of first side. We're also interested on the income side. Was there a decline in income for these households? They got this cash, maybe they stopped working. No, if anything here, the point estimates are positive, about $131 increase, not significant, but a pretty sizable magnitude. And this is coming from both an increase in profits and wage earning, neither significant, but the bulk of it seems to be coming from higher wage earnings. So again, sort of labor income seems to be the driver here for income. Clearly not a decline in income for these households. Okay, so consumption goes up, income also goes up somewhat, but some of the consumption gain is just coming from the transfer, not the income alone. So those are the kind of recipient households. The next step in the causal chain are firms. So again, here, there's a bunch of columns here, and let me try to make sense of them. Focus mainly here on columns 2 and 3. Column 2 is the effect in villages that were treated, that received cash. Column 3 is the effect in control villages that only experienced the spillovers within, say, a few kilometers. You can see that here. I just want to, again, just for the interest of time, let me focus on enterprise revenue. Enterprise revenue goes up by a lot in both of these types of villages by about $300. And $300 was and this is $300 per household in the village. Everything is normalized per household. This is almost exactly the amount that consumption per household also went up. So there's this kind of correspondence between spending per household and revenue per household that line up. And looking at the data, this shouldn't be too surprising. 90% of shopping that households say they do goes on in their own village. And when we ask firms who their customers are, over 90% come from the same village. So there's just really a lot of localized shopping here. So it kind of makes sense that the dollars are spent locally, and we can kind of capture it in the firm surveys. Enterprise costs also go up, mainly the wage bill. So revenue goes up, the wage bill goes up. That's an important finding, and it's going to be important for understanding the non-recipient effect. What we don't see here, if you jump down a few rows, is any increase in enterprise investment. And we have several different measures of investment. This is just one here, but we're not really seeing a supply side investment response. What we're really seeing is an increase in revenue and then being paid out in the wage bill. Okay, so let me keep moving forward here. and go on to the non-recipient households. So, the next step in the causal chain here, now that we've shown that enterprise revenue goes up and there's these effects on local businesses, is to study what happens to the non-recipient households. And the patterns here are also quite interesting. Here I want to focus on column 3. So this gets back to the, actually I think I may be frozen here. Can you guys hear me okay? Can people give me a thumbs up if you can hear me, or? Oops.
We can hear you.
You can hear me.
You sound
okay.
fine, Ted.
Good. Okay. I thought maybe I was frozen. Good. Okay. So let me focus on the non-recipient households here. The next step in the causal chain, focusing on column 3, we have the income of these untreated households. They didn't get the cash transfer. We look at them about a year to a year and a half later, and we find that their income has gone up substantially by about $200 per year annualized. And the vast majority of this is coming through wage earnings. So again, the wage bill that we saw being paid out through firms is being translated into untreated households earning more. This is a very important indication of spillovers and the multiplier here as well. Okay, so non-recipient households are benefiting appear to be benefiting in terms of higher income, and then they're also benefiting in terms of higher consumption. If you look at the top row there, big increases in household consumption, very similar in magnitude to the recipient household. So if you compare columns 2 and 3 in the top row, you can see that there's an important word here about timing. Again, we're collecting data a year or a year and a half after this program is starting. And when we look at retrospective consumption, we are almost certainly missing some of the consumption in the very first few months after the transfer, the first couple transfers went out. So the consumption here for the recipient household is almost certainly understating the total consumption gain that they experience. And that's probably why the magnitudes of the recipient and non-recipient households here are so similar, because of the time lag. One thing we were able to do is get data from a neighboring county, Rarieda County in Kenya, where my co-author, Johannes Haushofer, has a very similar RCT looking at cash transfers that people may be familiar with. It was published in the QJ a few years ago. From that data from Rarieda, they actually did collect very short-run consumption response data. Okay, so and that would boost consumption in the recipient households a bit more. When we combine our data on consumption a little bit farther out with the Rarieda data, again, which studied the same magnitude cash transfer, in the first few months, our best guess as to what the marginal propensity to consume, really the marginal propensity to spend this money in the local economy was about 0.7. So that's just a number to keep in mind, that the MPC to spend sort of within this first year or so locally was about 70%. Okay, so a number to keep in mind going forward. Okay, let me keep moving forward, because maybe I'll just take another 5 minutes or so, and then we can transition over to questions. This table here shows prices. So I know I'm hurrying a little bit here, but we've gone through now kind of tracing out the flow of funds. The big question we're left with is, are all of these consumption and income effects real or nominal? And what we're finding when we look at prices is really minimal price inflation, as I alluded to before. If you focus on column 1, this is the average amount of inflation in areas that received cash. It's about 0.1 to 0.2 of a percent. Column 2 is the different quantity. This is the average effect in the months around the maximum local transfer. The idea being that when the surge of cash comes in those initial months, that might be when we experience the greatest increase in prices. In those sort of maximum months, the average price inflation is about 0.5 of a percent. So all these numbers are in percent, and 0.5 of a percent is still quite small. So that's just something that I wanted to have you guys keep in mind, that even in the sort of maximal months, inflation is quite low. There's further breakdown I could get into here with non-tradables and market access, but let me just skip those in the interest of time. In all cases, price inflation is quite quite small. Okay, now the area where there are some price effects, as I alluded to before, are on input prices. So if we look at the first row, this is the hourly wage reported in surveys. And if we focus on column 3 in particular, this is the hourly wage experienced by the non-recipients. They are reporting an hourly wage increase of about 19 cents on the dollar on a base in column 4 of about 70 cents per hour in terms of their wage. So a really sizable wage effect. Again, these are only marginally significant, but suggestive of wages increasing. But even though wages are going up, we're not seeing a response in terms of labor inputs, at least in terms of hours worked. So if we look at total household hours worked in the last 7 days, across columns 1, 2, and 3, we're really not seeing any effects there. So there isn't a sort of reported increase in labor inputs. Similarly, if we look at land or capital, either the price of capital, people taking out loans, we're not really seeing much of a response. So in terms of other inputs, there's not so much going on, and the lack of any sort of response in terms of folks taking out loans is also consistent with the lack of an investment response that we're really seeing across the board here. Okay, so let me get to the fiscal multiplier, and then we'll start moving towards wrapping up. We use a kind of standard definition of the fiscal multiplier. We can compute the multiplier either using our expenditure data or income data. Let me not get into all the details here, but I think, again, this is pretty standard. And we use a very similar sort of empirical specification, but instead of sort of adding up transfers, over time, we look at them. We're basically computing the impulse response function. We're looking at the effect of transfers at different points in the past so that we can see how past transfers affect later consumption and revenue, all the different components that go into the multiplier. Okay, and everything I'll present here is in real terms. We deflate them back to 2015 US dollars. Okay, so what do we find? When we look at the expenditure side multiplier, adding up the effects over time, over the several years we have data, we get a multiplier estimate of about 2.3. When we look at the income side, we get a multiplier of about 2.4. So again, these use different components of our data, but they give us a very similar answer, which again makes sense because remember, our consumption numbers and our income and our revenue numbers were roughly lining up in the analysis. Since we don't really favor either of these conceptually one over the other, at the bottom, we present our sort of favorite estimates, taking the average of the two, and we get this multiplier effect of 2.37. We can certainly reject that the multiplier is greater than 0, and we have some marginally significant estimates, marginally significant evidence that the multiplier is greater than 1. So again, there's a bit of a power issue here. I'll just say, we run the multiplier a few different ways. Part of the reason why there's relatively large standard errors on this is the issue I raised earlier on. In the first few months after transfers went out, we lack quite a bit of data. Only a relatively small number of households have data just in those first couple months after transfers went out. And that just leads to relatively noisy estimates of the multiplier effects in the first 1 or 2 quarters after the transfer. So that's part of the story. You can see the results visually here. The x-axis is quarters since the transfer went out, and then the y-axis is the spillover effect, the sort of broader effects on economic output beyond the transfer itself. You can see these are positive throughout. Maybe towards the end they start dipping down a little bit, and we integrate this to get the multiplier. On the income side, there's something very similar. We look at all the different components of the multiplier on the income side and add those up, integrate those up to get the transfer multiplier. Okay, so this is again, really where the data is coming from is integrating this up over time. Okay, I think I'm pretty short on time. John and Rob can give me an indication of when I should stop. So I'm going to just very quickly go through welfare and Slack, maybe a minute or 2 each, just so we can have some open discussion, because I've already touched on some of these issues. On the welfare side, the main thing that I want to do, I'm just going to jump ahead a couple of slides to get to the kind of takeaway slide, which is we're really finding evidence of welfare gains here pretty unambiguously. We're seeing large increases in income, but not seeing big increases in sort of labor supply, which would, lead to some disutility. We're also not seeing meaningful consumer price inflation. So these effects are real that we're documenting. And again, that multiplier number was a real multiplier, not just nominal. We're also seeing increases in expenditures without dissaving. If you look at asset ownership and wealth among the non-recipients, it doesn't fall. If anything, it goes up. So it really does feel like there is a welfare gain. In terms of the externality side, and again, I haven't had time to go into many of these, we measured a wide range of household and community outcomes. And if anything, non-recipients are experiencing small gains in these dimensions or sort of no effects. Non-recipients tend to be maybe a little happier if there was more cash that went into their area. Child outcomes are somewhat better. There's no increase in domestic violence. There's no increase in crime. There's no drop in public goods, et cetera. So we don't see the kind of adverse effects of cash going in that you might fear. Okay, so that's the punchline on welfare, and I'll skip a few slides here. And then just jump to capacity utilization. And the idea here is, how can we be producing these gains without greater labor supply or investment? And I think that is, one of the big questions that we're asking ourselves this question really throughout working on this project. There's a variety of evidence from our data and from other data in East Africa suggesting that in steady state, a lot of these small firms have a lot of slack. For instance, the typical grain mill where people take their maize to be ground is a one-man operation or one-woman operation with one kind of big machine and one worker working there. And a lot of the time, a big share of the day, they're sort of just waiting around for customers. So in that kind of setting, even though that's a profitable operation for the owner of the grain mill, they're still making profits. People come in, it's still worthwhile investing in that kind of firm. There's a lot of slack capacity. When there's more aggregate demand locally, they can pretty easily meet that capacity. And there's sort of example after example of that from carpentry shops where workers are waiting around for parts of the day, et cetera. And these tie into some classic ideas actually in development economics going back to Lewis. Okay, so this is my last slide, and then we can turn it over to questions. Hopefully we'll have 5 or 6 minutes for questions. We find that a large-scale cash transfer program benefited recipients and non-recipients and generates a pretty sizable local transfer multiplier of about 2.4. We see this study and others in the same vein, kind of new work in development economics, as a bit of pushback against the critique that experimental trials are only good for tinkering around the edges, for small-scale programs. We're finding that you can use experiments at scale to study even big classic questions in economics, and we're very happy that we were able to tackle this question, this program. Another big concern in this literature is that maybe when cash comes flooding in to an area, there's going to be all kinds of adverse effects for the non-recipients. We don't find evidence for that here. And in fact, if we hadn't counted all the benefits for the non-recipients, we would have way undercounted the welfare gains from this program. So it's very, very important to count benefits for both recipients and non-recipients in order to understand this program in terms of social welfare, public policy, et cetera. And then the last point is COVID related, which is the fact that injecting cash into a poor economy kind of radiates out and benefits local firms and other households is maybe particularly salient right now as dozens of countries are ramping up cash transfer and social assistance programs because of the COVID crisis. Okay, so let me just leave it there.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Ted. That was excellent. Thank you so much. The Q&A has been really hot, and Johannes and Dennis have done a great job of doing our job, essentially, of responding to a lot of the questions. So thank you, Dennis and Johannes, for that. I think, so one question that I was thinking about getting your thoughts on, Ted, was how does expectations come into this experiment? So does the treatment group know with certainty of when the payments are going to end, and there was 3 payments only? And does the control group think that they might be receiving some payments in the future? And so they starting to increase their spending because they know that Give Directly might come in and make this a fair treatment for everyone and give payments in the future. So thinking about expectations would be quite helpful.
That's a great question. So this program was targeted to the poor, and the poor were identified using this proxy means test, which related to sort of housing quality. So folks were sort of, their eligibility was determined based on that, and it was pretty clear cut, it was visible. So I think households knew whether they were going to be eligible or not. Give Directly had been working in Western Kenya with this exact same model for a few years before our program, and they'd always done this sort of like one-time transfer just to the poor households, and then they moved on. And that's exactly what they did here in our setting. So Give Directly was fairly well known. They announced this design. They followed through with this design. So our sense is these somewhat wealthier households that were ineligible did not expect to receive transfers overall. But I don't think we can completely rule that out, but that was consistent with the pre-existing design. Another issue related to expectations is the fact that there were 3 transfers that went out, as I mentioned, like a small one and 2 larger ones. And you might imagine maybe behavior is slightly different around each of those transfers. Right now, we're really treating cash as cash and looking at the effects of all the transfers together. But the first transfer that went out when the cash arrived might have been more unexpected than the third. And so that's something that we abstract away from a little bit, but relates to your question, Rob.
Cool. Thanks, Ted.
Ted, that was really good. That's
Thanks,
a nice contribution. So I know that you have some spotty data on expenditures, but let's think about expenditures in the pre-period, in the experimental period, and after the experiment is done. What do you think that the expenditure profile should look like between treatment and control? In the pre, obviously you're balanced, so they should be equal. Now go from there and help us conceptually, and then give us some insights about what your data have said.
You're saying especially going forward, what should we see? What should we think of going forward, John?
Yeah, even in the experimental period and then going forward, what does your model say that the profile of expenditures should be comparing the treatment and control groups?
Yeah, I mean, I think certainly in the pre-period, there's balance here because of the randomization, you're right, about that. Our best sense right now in the data is there was a big increase in consumption among the treated right away, which I think conceptually makes sense. If we think of these as high marginal propensity to consume folks, hand to mouth folks, and the data bears out that view. We see the time pattern is pretty interesting because as consumption for the recipients is sort of leveling off after that big initial spike, it's sort of ramping up among the non-recipients. And the timing there makes sense because, over time they're earning more. The, firm wage bills are going up and these individuals are earning more and then they're consuming more. So there really is a kind of different time pattern for consumption. And I think it theoretically makes sense given the dynamics that I showed you in the multiplier figure. Just very quickly on the going forward, I think it's really an open question what happens to these groups like several years down the road. As soon as COVID ends and we can get back out in the field, our plan is to resurvey the treated and controlled communities, recipients and non-recipients, to try to understand what the legacy of this program could be. I mean, you could imagine a lot of reasons why there could be some persistent effects, but there's very little evidence of that. So that's our goal for the next stage of this project.
No, I think that's great. So I was thinking, well, it depends if they invest in an asset that gives dividends in some form, then you could envision a consumption flow that was higher going forward. But 2 things that puzzled me in the data were first of all, that labor supply didn't, so treatment and control should have the same labor supply, right? And what was interesting then was why did wages go up for the control group but not the treated group? If they were balanced in the pre, what dynamic happened for one group but not the other?
Yeah, we've looked at that and wondered about that too. And I think, I have 2 responses. One is statistical and one is, I think, more interesting, economics, which is statistically there's, pretty big standard errors on those wage estimates for the recipients and non-recipients. We can't reject equality, but you're right that the numbers are quite striking. And, our best sense of this, might be that the The non-recipients who were better off, these sort of like mainly ineligible households, were almost like in a better position to take advantage of these cash infusions. They were working in firms or own firms that allowed them to profit from this increase in economic activity more than these poorer recipient households. So to that extent, since they're somewhat different, they could have benefited more. And in fact, when we look at the profitability of I didn't show you guys this for reasons of time, we know which firms are owned by the eligibles and the ineligibles. A lot of those profit and revenue gains are larger among the firms owned by the ineligibles, who are a little bit better off, maybe a little better at business. So that kind of heterogeneity, I think, is lurking in the background here.
Okay, that's helpful, but I thought they would have been all else equal in the pre-period. So they should have all been as equal to take advantage of whether they got it or not. They're still all else equal. What, did I miss something with the randomization?
Yeah, the point, you're actually, I didn't explain it clearly, but the majority of those non-recipients are ineligible households. Some of them were, yes, eligibles in controlled communities. Some of them were these wealthier households that didn't get cash. So when we're looking at the treated and the untreated here, there we're kind of pooling the eligible, the poor who didn't get cash, and these somewhat wealthier guys who didn't get cash. So there are some differences there. If you just look at the eligibles that got cash and didn't get cash, like were more or less exposed to cash, you're right, they look more similar. Those differences are being driven by these richer guys. So your point is spot on that they should be balanced, and they are. It's the like wealthier guys in the areas that got cash that seem to benefit the most. Does that, I hope that I clarified it, and I'm sorry if I...
No, that's good. So thanks for that. Yeah, thanks for that clarification, Ted. That's good.
Yeah, just one quick question, Ted. So there's tons of PhD students and postdocs and young professors listening. What would you have done differently, looking back now that you've got the results and the design? Was there one thing that you wish you've done which would have helped the paper, or think about future research?
100%. There is literally one thing we would have done differently, is we would have loaded up more data collection right after the transfers went out. And we do have that data for like a few hundred households out of our 8,000 something, but we're quite underpowered in that first quarter after transfers go out. And as we've learned from other data and anecdotally, a lot of spending was going on in that first quarter. And I think that is the mistake we made, or that's the thing we would have improved. We still have some data, but again, if you go back to those figures, if these slides are posted, you'll see that like in that first quarter, confidence intervals are really wide because we don't have enough data. We're very lucky that Johannes did a very similar experiment in the neighboring county to give us a better sense of that MPC in the first quarter. But we clearly, that would be, I think all my team, all my co-authors on the call will agree, that was the thing we would go back and change. I've been on a couple dozen RCTs in the field over time, and I think in every single experiment, there's a couple things you want to go back and change. So for the young scholars on the call, and I know John, has done a million experiments, there's almost always something you would tweak a little bit that you would improve. So that was our limitation here.
Awesome, thanks, Ted. That's helpful.
No, that's absolutely right, Ted. So unfortunately, as like sand through the hourglass, these are the days of our lives. This went quickly, but really excellent paper. I think that this is, to me, a very important future of field experimentation under the tent of thinking about scaling, thinking about what sorts of results are treatments affecting beyond, some initial outcome variable, but thinking about using macro tools and macro type questions around the sense of general equilibrium effects, which is, I think, in the end going to be a very important player when we think about scaling policies. So I really applaud you for, again, taking on another very important issue in lending insights. This is really good stuff. And for all the young people on the call, I urge you to look at this, look at, in a methodological sense, what's going on here in the type of questions, because the types of questions that are going on in this particular study, I think, are going to be really important for laying the groundwork for the future. So I want to say congratulations, really good stuff. And
thanks, John.
Everyone have a super week. Stay safe, stay healthy, stay productive. Ted, Michael, and Johannes, thanks again. And Rob, who do we have next week?
Yeah, so next week we got Hunt Olcott from NYU, given his paper on the high interest loans, payday loans, predatory theory and evidence from payday lending. So a little bit similar to this, a little bit of flavor. Looking forward to it.
Awesome. Thanks
Cool.
again.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.
Take care, everyone.
Have a good day.
Thanks, Ted.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.